This is Creepy, a podcast dedicated to sharing the most famous, chilling, and disturbing creepypastas and urban legends in the world. Whether these stories truly happened or are simply fabrications is for you to decide. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Creepy presents I Was the Only Passenger on This Plane When We Landed. Written by EaPaTbp and narrated by Michelle Kane.
I boarded the flight from New York to California at 7:15 a.m. It was a nonstop flight, and I was the only one on board, which I realized a few seconds after boarding and then confirmed with the flight attendant. I've always had a slight fear of flying. It wasn't the fact that I was stuck in a giant metal box for hours at a time that necessarily scared me, but rather the fact that I could end up in a sci-fi plot at any second. I know this is an irrational fear, but it's hard to remember that when you're thousands of feet up in the air. Surprisingly, being the only passenger somehow diminished my fears, and I felt a bit safer, like there was a less chance of something bad happening if I was the only one on board. And so, I found myself dozing off a mere few minutes into the flight. I was already tired from having to wake up early to get to the airport, and I figured I had time to take a nap and catch up on sleep. I'm normally the type of person to have bizarre dreams, and yet this time I had a completely soundless, dreamless sleep. When I woke up, there was complete silence. I stretched my neck out a bit and then my arms. I glanced out the window and saw nothing but clouds and sky. I checked my watch for the time and realized I had only slept for about 30 minutes, even though I felt incredibly groggy. The kind of grogginess that comes when you're ill and fall asleep after downing half a bottle of cold medicine. I rubbed my eyes and shook my head around a bit to wake myself up. But my eyelids fought back, heavily closing every time I blinked, as if they were being weighed down by something. I didn't want to fall asleep again. My heart began to pound in my chest as I felt my body freeze, as if I was in some sort of sleep paralysis trance. I focused on moving my arms and legs and finally decided to get up and go into the bathroom to splash some water on my face, hoping that would help me stay awake. I got up slowly, moving my legs around as I awkwardly marched in place a bit, and then proceeded to scoot past the empty seats next to me and out into the aisle. As I turned around to head towards the bathroom, I noticed there was something off about the plane and froze. There were 3 other passengers on board now. One of them was in the far left on the plane, the other 3 rows behind me, and the third was in the middle near the last row. There were 2 women and 1 man. The man was dressed in a clean white suit and wore huge dark-rimmed sunglasses on his face. One of the women wore a plain white dress, her hair neatly slicked back and gathered in a ponytail at the nape of her neck and hung over her left shoulder. The other woman wore what appeared to be pajamas, an oversized black shirt and a pair of gray sweatpants. All 3 of them sat up straight with their hands in their laps and stared straight ahead with blank expressions on their faces. For a second, I thought I was dreaming, although I was pretty sure this was real and something odd was happening. I took a tentative step, expecting the other passengers to look at me or attack me, but nobody moved. And so I continued to slowly walk to the bathroom, picking up my pace as I started to feel like someone was watching me. I closed the door shut behind me and leaned over the sink, opening the faucet and cupping my hands together to gather water, which I then splashed on my face. It was colder than I expected, and I gasped, and then sputtered as I accidentally swallowed some of the water. Once I managed to catch my breath and calm down, I turned off the faucet and opened the door, heading back to my seat. Again, I walked slowly at first, as if to not disturb any of the passengers, and then picked up my pace and practically dove into my seat as I began to feel like something was going to happen to me if I didn't hurry. I sat in my seat, facing forward and refusing to turn around. My hands were sweating, and I wiped them on my pants periodically as I tried to calm myself down and think logically. How had the other passengers gotten on the plane? Surely I would have woken up if we had landed somewhere, right? There would have been some sort of announcement that would have snapped me awake. Maybe the flight attendant lied when she told me I was the only one on board, but why? For fun? Was this some sort of prank designed to freak me out? I didn't know what to do, and I hadn't seen a flight attendant in a while, so I decided to stay in my seat, fighting the urge to turn around. I was afraid of what I might see, while simultaneously afraid of what I wasn't seeing. If I were in a horror movie, this would be the part where the audience can see the killer in the background as they yell at the main character to turn around. I don't know how long I had been sitting there, staring into the seat in front of me, before a movement in my peripheral caught my attention. I took a deep breath and slowly turned to the right, where I saw one of the female passengers walking her way down the aisle. Her movements were strange, sharp, and robotic, like her limbs were stiff and she hadn't moved in years. I watched as she threw one of her legs forward, her body lurching along with it. She wobbled as she gained her balance and then threw the other leg forward. While she did this, her hands remained stiff at her sides, while her head faced forward. She stopped before she reached the row that I was seated in, and her head moved from right to left in a stiff motion, the way a security camera would. She scanned the plane before her eyes landed on me. I held my breath as I waited for something to happen, but nothing did. Instead, she simply threw her leg forward again and continued to make her way towards the front of the plane. I finally got the courage to turn around and look behind me, but the rest of the passengers were still sitting down in their seats. I sat up a bit in my seat to double-check that everyone else was still in their seat, and then sat back down. As I turned to face forward, I found myself face to face with the woman, who was back now and standing near the row in front of me, staring right at me. Her face was expressionless. She simply stared, as if she was waiting for me to do something. "Is something wrong?" I asked her. She continued to stare, and slowly her eyebrows pushed together, as if she appeared to be taking in what I said. My heart was pounding in my chest as I waited for her to do something, anything. I must have only stared at her for a few seconds, but the seconds stretched out into what felt like hours. Finally, she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, a garbled sound came out of her mouth. It sounded like someone was skipping through dozens of radio stations, but never stopping on one long enough to make out any words. It was a warbled sound, a combination of all different speaking tones and octaves that didn't make any sense. Her lips moved, so I knew she was producing the sounds herself, and she continued to make the noise as if she thought I could understand what she was saying. After a few seconds of that, she stopped and simply made her way back to her seat without so much as a look back. Unsettled, I checked my watch. There was still a little over 3 hours left before we landed, and I found myself spinning around to try and find a flight attendant. 20 minutes later, I finally saw her as she made her way towards the back of the plane. I had no idea where she had come from, and I thought about asking, but I had bigger issues on my mind. Excuse me, I called, catching her attention. Yes, she smiled, leaning towards me. Where did the rest of the passengers come from? I asked. She stood up straight and looked around the plane. What other passengers? I pointed my thumb behind me, motioning toward the direction of the others. The other 3 people. They weren't here when we took off, so where did they come from? I asked. The flight attendant laughed awkwardly as she looked towards the back of the plane. I don't know what you're talking about. Everyone that is on the plane is supposed to be on the plane. I shook my head. No, the other flight attendant told me I was the only passenger when I boarded. That must have been a mistake. Where in the sky do you think these people snuck in here? She asked. Well, I don't know. I'm starting to think they might have. The flight attendant looked at me with a strange look on her face, as if I were the one who had suddenly appeared on the plane mid-flight. Never mind, I replied, feeling defeated. Someone had to be messing with me, but why? And for what purpose? I decided to just stay in my seat and not interact with anyone else for the duration of the flight. That worked out fine for the next few minutes, until the second female passenger began to make her way down the aisle. I looked back as she started walking towards the front of the plane, one aisle over. She held onto the tops of the seats as she walked slowly. Something was weird, and I continued to watch her as she walked with her head down. When she passed the row I was in, I noticed she was heavily pregnant. Even though I was sure she hadn't been when I'd seen her the first time. Her other hand rested on her stomach as she staggered down the aisle before finally stopping and dropping to the ground. I stood up, looking at her over the seats as she laid back with her legs bent. I took a few steps forward, trying to make sure she was okay. She laid there, her face expressionless as she stared up. Then she opened her mouth, and the loud and gritting sound of TV static mixed with the horrible screeching sound filled the entire cabin. I pressed my palms against my ears, but that did little to block out the sound. I turned to look at the other passengers, but they sat still, as if they couldn't hear anything at all. After about 10 excruciating seconds, it stopped. And I watched as the woman stood up as if nothing had happened, smoothed out her dress, and then bent over and picked up a baby off the ground. The baby was swaddled in a white blanket and silent as the woman carried it back to her seat with her. Freaked out, I looked around for the flight attendant again, but she was nowhere to be found. I stood up slowly and made my way to the back of the plane. The woman in the white dress sat up straight in her seat as she held the baby in her arms. I looked towards the man who had not moved at all this entire time, and still wasn't. I glanced towards the other woman, the one I had seen walking around at first, but she also sat still in her seat, staring straight ahead. I continued to walk, passing the bathroom, which was empty, and walked towards the first-class cabin. I slid open the door and walked into the dark cabin. There were no lights on, and all the windows were closed. There were no passengers back there, but it wasn't empty. The 2 flight attendants I had seen were both standing in the middle of the aisles, one in each, with their backs to me. "Hello?" I called. Neither one of them moved. I called out a few more times, but it was as if they couldn't hear me. Finally, I decided to turn back around and head to my seat, feeling even more freaked out as I realized that something weird was going on and I had no way of escaping the scenario until we landed. I was starting to feel lightheaded, and I began to panic, and I headed to the bathroom again, once again splashing water on my face as I took deep breaths to calm myself down. When I felt like I could breathe again, I headed out towards my seat. I passed the woman and her baby again. Only her baby was no longer a baby. There was a small girl sitting in the seat next to the woman. She was no more than 2 years old and wore an all-white outfit, her blonde hair tucked behind her ears. I stopped and stared for a few seconds, confused as to how the child had gone from a baby to a 2-year-old so damn fast. The little girl caught me staring and looked up at me with large blue eyes. I didn't move and continued to stare until she opened her mouth and let out the most god-awful wailing sound. I stepped back and covered my ears as she continued to cry, tears streaming down her face. Only this was even worse than a normal child crying on a plane. I stumbled back to my seat and waited for the girl to stop crying. Once she finally did, my head pounded from the noise. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back on the seat. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I was being woken up by someone poking my face. I opened my eyes to see the little girl from before. Only now she looked even older, at least 10 years old. She grinned when my eyes opened and then jumped off the seat, running towards the back of the cabin. I sat up and turned around, watching as she peeked at me from the side of the seat in front of her. I glanced down at my watch. Less than 2 hours left. I stood up and the girl stared at me from her seat as her mother sat perfectly still. As I looked closer, I noticed that her mom looked older too. In fact, all of the passengers did. They had gray hair and wrinkles that weren't there before. As I looked back towards the girl, she held up her hand and gave me the middle finger. I rolled my eyes and returned to my seat. I tried to ignore the girl as she skipped up and down the aisle silently with a grin on her face. I watched her as she headed back towards the back when she suddenly tripped over her feet and fell face first into the floor. I stared at her as she pushed herself back up and looked at me. Her mouth was covered in blood and she met my eye for about 3 seconds before she opened her mouth and once again began crying. The cry wasn't as shrill as the last time. Instead, it sounded a few octaves lower, but was still extremely loud. I covered my ears again as the girl headed back to her seat. My feelings about the situation were beginning to shift from scared to annoyed, and I tried my best to block out the sound of the girl's cries. Eventually, she stopped, although I wasn't aware of when exactly she did. I spent the remainder of the flight looking at my watch, which didn't seem to advance at all. I turned around once again, just in time to see one of the flight attendants come from the back of the plane. I stared straight ahead as she made her way towards the front, without so much as a glance at me. I turned around again to look at the girl and noticed she had once again gotten older. This time, she looked to be about 17 or 18, and she sat still in her seat, staring straight ahead. I stood up, walked around the cabin, looking at the other passengers. The original 3 now looked a lot older, around 50 or 60. They were slightly hunched over in their seats. I began to once again get paranoid, so I made my way back to the bathroom to look at myself in the mirror. I looked fine. I was still the same age and looked the same age as I had when I boarded. I let out a sigh of relief as I walked back out of the bathroom, running right into the flight attendant. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I said, backing up. She looked up at me and I noticed that her hair was graying and there were new wrinkles on her forehead and near her eyes. "It's all right," she said, walking back to the first-class cabin. I suddenly began to feel anxious again as I thought about the pilot. Was he also experiencing this speed of aging? At this rate, what would happen when we finally landed? How old would these people be? I passed the passengers again, this time noticing there was something wrong with the man. He sat with his head hanging to one side, his eyes open and unblinking. I took a step toward him and leaned over, holding my finger under his nose. He was no longer breathing. I took a few steps back and looked around. The other 2 women had experienced the same fate, and all 3 passengers were now dead, while the girl appeared to now be in her mid-30s. I checked my watch again. 45 minutes. For the remainder of the flight, I stood there watching as the bodies on the plane began to decompose. I watched in shock as the dead bodies proceeded to bloat and then began to decay as the skin rotted while it was being eaten away by maggots. The smell of rotting flesh filled the cabin, and I pulled my shirt over my nose as I gagged and tried not to throw up. I watched as the clothing the passengers once wore became dirty with fluids secreting from the decaying bodies as they turned black. It continued, the cabin filled with the stench of death until they were nothing but skeletons and clothing. By that point, the girl had also aged rapidly and had begun decaying. I retreated to my seat and took deep breaths, trying not to vomit as the smell from the bodies buried itself in my nostrils. I closed my eyes, and tears began to fall out from the intensity of the odors in the cabin. I was so focused on keeping it together that I didn't even notice when we had landed. The familiar ding caught my attention, and I opened my eyes. Once I realized we were back on the ground, I got up and began to grab my bags, taking one last look at the remnants of the other passengers. I don't remember getting off the airplane. The whole thing is a bit of a blur. I do, however, remember what happened after. I remember standing there as I watched people run through the airport. I remember there being a lot of commotion as people wondered what was going on. And I remember hearing someone finally answer the dozens of questions that were floating around. There was no pilot on that plane.